So welcome. I'm David Brown, interim head of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the third panel in a series of panel discussions. So here's the series. There's a great deal of complexity in education and educational reform, and faculty in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction look deeply into these complex issues in our scholarship. And we wanted to find a way to celebrate this scholarship and to bring awareness of this scholarship to a broad audience. So this series of panels, this looks a little bit closer at the wording, will allow C&I faculty to articulate differing and sometimes even competing perspectives on pressing issues of education in a format that will allow for a great deal of open and vigorous discussion. Unlike many talks where there are a few minutes at the end for questions, we wanted to have at least half of each session available for open discussion of the issues. Distinguished moderators from outside the department, in this case Dr. James Anderson, will help bring fresh perspectives in the examination of these issues and will help to guide these open discussions. And we look forward to continuing these invigorating discussions, and we certainly hope you'll be able to attend the final panel in addition to this one. But now I'd like to turn to today's panel, the third one listed here. Issues of diversity and equity are among the most pressing for educational context today. And our panel today will address a number of these issues, including disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline for young people of color, multidisciplinary approaches to understanding barriers to school success, language differences in the construction of school failure, out-of-school learning as it relates to school success, and barriers to school engagement for immigrant families. I'll leave it up to the panelists to say more about these and other issues, but I did want to say a little bit about each of the panelists before they speak. I'll say a little bit more about our distinguished moderator, Jim Anderson, before the open discussion. Eurydice Bauer is an associate professor of language and literacy. Her research focuses on the literacy development, instruction, and assessment of students from diverse linguistic, economic, and cultural backgrounds, with a specific focus on bilingual reading and writing. Her current work focuses on the bilingual biliteracy development of students in dual language settings. Thorstensson Dávila is a clinical assistant professor in language and literacy and curriculum aesthetics and teacher education. Her scholarship looks at bi and multilingual students' language and literacy development, classroom pedagogies that support access and equity, and global perspectives on immigration and language education. Her work stresses the importance of adopting ecological perspectives on language learning and school success that cross school, home, and community contexts. Stephanie Sanders-Smith is an assistant professor in the Yu Chung Bernard Spodek Scholar in Early Childhood Education. She studies the sociocultural context of early childhood programs in urban settings and how those contexts impact relationships between teachers and students and between teachers and families. She finds that many well-meaning school policies have the unintended effect of severely limiting school engagement opportunities for poor families of color in urban settings and can have significant negative impacts on Latin American immigrant families. Murillo is an associate professor of bilingual literacy and reading education. She uses critical ethnography to study the language, literacy, and cultural practices of Latino and transnational children and families. To address the national education debt to historically marginalized groups, she advocates for reallocation of economic, human, and literacy resources to support academic biliteracy for all children. Stafford Hood is the Sheila M. Miller Professor of Education and Director of the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment, or CREA. His work primarily focuses on the importance of cultural context in program evaluation. He is also deeply concerned with the U.S. pattern of grossly disproportionate incarceration of African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. He is currently considering the distinct likelihood that a sizable number of incarcerated individuals from these groups could have high STEM-related abilities and have potentially been STEM degree recipients instead of casualties in the prison pipeline. So with those introductions, I'd like to now invite our first panelist, Eurydice Bauer, to start us off. And after that, each of the others will briefly present their perspective. Each presenter will have 4 to 5 minutes, which should allow us a good amount of time for open discussion at the end. So I'll turn this over to Eurydice.
And how do we move the next? There we go. All right, so our question for today is, right, do schools really treat Blacks, Latinas, and immigrant lives as if they matter? This is a big question, and I think part of that answer is that it's a complex kind of issue. So what does that mean? Well, part of it is that I think we have to talk about, are we looking at schools at the individual level, or are we talking about schools as a system? I think everyone in this room, or most of us in this room, have knowledge of a particular school that's done a pretty good job, or a very good job, of educating these students. But unfortunately, we have to say that is not the norm. In fact, these schools must work against a system of schooling that is typically set up for this population. And in order to be successful in that space, teachers have to take a different stance. Teachers have to basically establish themselves and take the stance that your life matters to me. And for that reason, I am willing to adjust my teaching so that it addresses your needs to increase the likelihood of success. It's a different orientation that leads to that success. Typically, the schools that we have that addresses the needs of these students are not very successful. And in fact, in looking at this quote, we see a young man who's at the university, after reading Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequality, struggling with his experiences and what he's gained from that text. He says, as I begin this log, I truly don't know where to start. Every page of this book seemed to uncover new depth of anger and frustration, sagging in the bottom of my stomach. Now, as I write, I wonder, where did this aggression come from? Maybe it's because I can see the world at large depicted in the gross inequalities Kozol illustrates. Maybe it's the overbearing consciousness I now have of the battle which needs to be waged against the current conditions of education and society as a whole. So why does this happen? Part of it is the fact that we have certain master narratives that are at play. One is that Anglo-centric curriculum is good for all students. All curriculums outside of that are viewed as add-on or as an elective. The other is that English monolingualism is the norm. Now, this is interesting considering the fact that worldwide that is not the case, but we accept that. So that means bilingualism, bidialectalism is problematized and or stigmatized. So where do we go from here? Part of our movement has to be that we go beyond what the title of this session suggests. And that is, Black, Latina, and immigrant lives are more complex and are not as distinct as the title might suggest. Certainly, there are Blacks that are multilingual, that are immigrants. There are Latinos that are immigrants. There are those who are not. The lines are not as distinct. What are the implications then for education? How do we change what we do in terms of educators? And for us here, how do we change our approaches to research? How do we move things forward? We typically, most people in this room were trained in a particular, from a particular perspective, and most of us operate within a particular silo. So how do we break out of that? What would those discussions be like if we did such a thing? How do we embrace the intersections? So I bring us back to a thought put forward by Derek Bell, a critical race scholar who argues that racism permeates the very fabric of our society, and our country was founded on racism and white supremacy. So as a country, we haven't done what we need to do to overturn this. White supremacy is the disease, and racist educational system that produces outcomes like we have today is one of the symptoms. So you asked, do schools treat these children as if they matter? I would say schools do treat diverse students in ways that shows they matter, but perhaps they matter very little. I turn it now to my colleague.
Hello, and thank you for attending our panel today. My talk, my presentation will draw on both what Dr. Brown and Dr. Bauer educational reform and the lack of attention to, or the lack of enough attention to, certain groups of students. And when we think about educational reform, we often think about who's doing well in school, and who's doing poorly in school, and why. And oftentimes, what gets omitted in these discussions and policies and practices are the wealth of experiences and knowledge students gain from out-of-school contexts that could be tapped into, but that isn't necessarily. And not entirely because teachers are bad teachers or uncaring, but because they lack time and space within the already standards-driven curriculum, rigidity within the curriculum. And so my research, and not only my research, much of your research, I'm sure, looks at issues, looks at education from a broader perspective, not just in terms of grades and academic performance, but contexts outside of school, and as well as relationships students form outside of school, and how those can be tapped into to foster learning. And so, again, my research has looked at these in a variety of contexts, and you can kind of read on your own. But what I'm talking about today largely is focused on the experiences of immigrant and refugee youth in a variety of contexts, and including classrooms, homes, community spaces, public performances, and so on. And so what I wish to put forth is the value of certain spaces, physical contexts, community contexts, as well as relationships, and the kinds of practices that students as individuals do within those contexts and within those relationships that can be not seen as deficits, which they most commonly are. We think about the students who aren't doing well in school. We often think about, or the media or the broader public often thinks about what parents aren't doing or what communities aren't doing, or how certain influences are negative on the lives of students. And so instead, I encourage us to look at spaces such as churches or other religious institutions and the kinds of learning that takes place in them. Community places such as the library, community after-school programs, which serve immigrant and refugee communities in enormous ways, workplace experiences, including the kinds of social networks that students build within those relationships. Things like teen marriage and pregnancy, which is common and part of many students' cultures and experiences, but is so often frowned upon and seen as and only looked at from the standpoint of something that the student did wrong. I also, and yet something which a student, an individual can learn a great amount from. Relationships between parents and siblings, and autonomous learning experiences at home through social media and other things. So in some of my research, I've looked at these contexts, these issues in these various contexts, and again with different groups of students. But here we see from a couple of examples from community contexts in which students are engaging in lots of learning, including literacy, which in the bottom picture you see. The student is at a mosque and engaging in an after-school learning program and specifically focused on Arabic literacy. So again, I just want to put forth the argument that for the need for us, including people not inside this room, to recognize students' full linguistic repertoires, knowledge acquired outside of school, experiences of migration, including the experiences of unaccompanied minors and others, resilience, resourcefulness, maturity, and focus, which many of these students often have developed more quickly because they've had to, and as a result of their resettlement experiences and migration experience. And the ability for many of these groups to work across linguistic boundaries, between and across linguistic boundaries. It doesn't get recognized enough, and that is my time. Thank you very much.
Talking a bit about immigration and immigrant families in schools. This is some of the work that I have been doing. So what we know is that family involvement is critical to school success. There is a huge body of literature telling us that family involvement is critical, which, if anyone is interested, this will be the topic of my fall course. That's my pitch. But we know that that increases graduation and lots of things. But we also know that in spite of these benefits, that it is not always happening in a majority of schools, particularly in schools serving children living in poverty. And we know why this is, that there are things having to do with where the parents work and transportations and disenfranchisement with schools. This we know. So what I've been working on is some schools that are serving vulnerable populations are unknowingly, through other things that they're doing, creating barriers to family engagement. And that this is a particular impact with immigrant families. So my case here, and this is some work that I've been doing with a colleague of mine at the University of Florida. So our case is Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade County is the 5th largest school district in the country. It has one of the largest percentages of immigrants, one of the largest numbers of immigrants. 70% of children in Miami-Dade County speak a language other than English at home. This is not a community that should be surprised to see immigrants in their schools. However, so some of the work that we have been doing has been talking to teachers about ways that they've been trying to reach out to families and why that hasn't been working for them. So here's one of the big issues: language. Notices at home, in a community where 70% of the children speak a language other than English at home, notices home not always translated into home language. So in a community like this, or a community where there isn't such a large share of immigrants, you can imagine what that looks like. So here's two teachers talking about a school that has a large Hispanic population, and here they're saying, yeah, sometimes we do send the notices home in English, but then all of the follow-up notices, not so much. Another issue, schools will translate but only to Spanish. So, huge number of Spanish speakers in Miami, it's not everybody. So here's a teacher who has a large population of Haitian Creole children. Again, a large population of Miami. So they're getting notices in English, they're getting notices in Spanish, they're not getting notices in their own language. Or trying to translate educational jargon. Even for teachers who are native Spanish speakers, they're having problems actually making the jargon understandable to parents who don't speak English. This is another issue, and this is a kind of a school safety that we want to give background checks to anybody who's coming into the schools. We want to make sure that everyone's safe. And this is an issue with parents who do have some sort of record, but this is also an issue with immigrant families. In Miami, a lot of immigrant families are not documented. And so you can imagine why they don't want to do a background check. So here we are. Parents are afraid to document themselves. They don't have a social security number, and they're scared to tell you that they don't have a social security number. So here's a teacher saying, already, this is a school that serves large numbers of children who live in poverty. The technology already is a barrier. So when I tell them to go home and register online, that's half my parents. But then I tell them they have to do a background check, you're losing more. And here they're talking about, in Florida, the police really don't have anything to do with immigration, but they don't know that. They're seeing things that are happening in other states like Arizona, and they don't want to tell you that they're not documented, and they don't want to come into the building. So here's where this leaves us. Depending on the circumstances surrounding immigration, immigrant families are leaving something. Yeah. Not all cases. You have good stories where people are coming for work, but you have a lot of these families, especially families living in poverty, that they're facing significant challenges to parenting and providing for the children's needs already. And these are things that we can help them with. We can connect to services, we can give support. These are the children that we need to be meeting. And we can learn about the children from them. We can learn a ton about the children from the parents, but our research is showing that the same factors that are putting these families at risk are creating barriers to the interventions that can help them.
I'm going to read my presentation because this is a tradition in anthropology, so please bear with me. So many of our students want to become teachers. Some are already practicing teachers seeking an endorsement or master's degree. Others want to become professors so that they can do research, educate teachers, and be on panels like this one. No matter where they are in their trajectories, our students are confronting two realities. There are more and more linguistic minority students in schools, and our schools are set up for such children to fail. To learn about the inextricable connections between language literacy and educational achievement, my students do inquiry projects with linguistically diverse learners. I ask students to learn from their participants and to avoid instructing so that they can learn more. I ask them to take on for a little while the role of researcher, someone who learns from asking questions, observing, considering theories, and reflecting. This is incredibly difficult for many students. They have a hard time suspending the desire to fix the deficiencies some children are assumed to have. Take the idea of struggling readers. Very few students at the beginning of the inquiry project question this notion. Few question the assumption that readers are struggling because they are from poor families or because they are African American and Latino children who speak non-prestige languages and varieties unwelcome in schools. Struggling readers is just one example of the pervasive deficit language used in educational settings. There are plenty of harmful terms: language barrier, reading problems, and at-risk students. My least favorite intervention suggests that the real job of teachers is to fix the language gaps of minoritized students. We are so concerned about fixing the language problems students are assumed to have that we are educating the next generation of teachers who will construct a school failure. In the time remaining, I will tell a story from my research. For the past year, I have been collecting ethnographic data on local literacies in a daycare center in a small community not far from our university. I began observing to learn about the language and literacy practices of immigrant families from Mexico and Guatemala who speak Spanish, English, Canjobal, and other indigenous languages. To my surprise and edification, working-class African-American and white children attend this daycare center too. And they bring with them ways of speaking that are also stigmatized in schools. What I see are families trying the best they can for their children under incredibly difficult circumstances. What I hear are powerful stories of labor and learning. One story is about the very young children between 6 months and 5 years old who begin each day at 3 in the morning when their parents drive them to a babysitter who watches them over until 5:30. Then they are bused to daycare. These children stay at daycare until 5 or 6 p.m. depending on their parents' shift at work. In the daycare center, where preschool children spend 12 hours a day, their caretakers are high school graduates. They have no specialized training in early childhood, but they care deeply about the children. They translate language in Spanish and English in acts of what Walter Mignolo calls bilanguage and love. How beautiful are you today, chiquito precioso? Oh, look at you. What beautiful trenzas you have today. Who made them for you? To mama? By language and love, but also teaching that transgresses the institution's dominant language conventions, requiring daycare workers to address children only in standardized English or only in standardized Spanish, fictitious languages that none of them claim to speak. Last summer, in preparation for the new school year, the teachers received professional development advising them that mixing languages is prohibited when speaking with children. At the same time, the bilingual books in the classrooms were replaced with English-only books. These steps were taken because of persistent deficit beliefs about negative effects of bilingualism on young children's cognitive and academic development. We want to assume that the daycare center means well. We want to hope that they really do care that all children learn, that misguided monolingual classroom rules are not grounded in malice, but in ignorance of how linguistically diverse children develop language and literacy and how they are intertwined. Thanks to decades of research, we really do know better than this. We know, thanks to Pedro Pedraza and others, about 100 años de pendejadas, 100 years of linguistic ignorance, about 100 years of deficit views about the Spanish-speaking children in U.S. schools. And I ask my students, and I ask you, who are we going to blame next? Thank you.
Are you going to be able to see that, David? Yeah, I can. All right. Blind. All right. Afternoon. Yeah, how you doing? Okay. Do I just need to? Oh, we do get there. A few brief comments that I'll provide are not mine alone. They've gone out of several conversations with my list of collaborators that have emerged after one of my presentations this fall, continued into conversations in the career office with my collaborators here, as well as we considered incidents of unarmed African-American men and women losing their lives at the hands of police, student unrest across our nation's campuses, about racial incivility, most notably at Mizzou, but also of note here at UIUC as well. Today we will share a few of at least our thoughts about strategies to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline for young people in the U.S. We have come here today really to recognizing that these are imperfect ideas that we have at this point, but we believe they are at least a starting place for refining, identifying, ultimately studying and acting upon what we consider to be some of our right questions, at least thus far. So we hope that during the discussion that follows that there is also even a few suggestions about other related questions we might try to consider. It is probably fair to say that Michelle Alexander's precise, skillful, and articulate, penetrating argument about the remanifestation of a Jim Crow system in the U.S. would not allow us to ignore this conversation, as unsettling as it might be. But I think this is one of possible many quotes in this particular book that are worth reading aloud. The stark and sobering realities is that for reasons largely unrelated to actual crime trends, the American penal system has emerged as a system of control unparalleled in world history. And while the size of the system alone might suggest that it would touch the lives of most Americans, the primary targets of its control can be defined largely by race. I'm hoping I don't really need to explain this graph to make this point regarding Michelle Alexander's point. And I chose these particular 3 states because of my own personal shared lived experience in these 3 states. For example, in Arizona, the African-American population is a little bit more than 4%. Native Americans is just a little bit above 5%. In Illinois, their percentage of Native Americans are at 1%. And in Wisconsin, they're just a little bit above 1%. I hope I don't really need to make this point, and hopefully it's obvious to you. While President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative, the subsequent recommendations from the task force submitted to the president by the Secretary of Education and the U.S. Attorney General that includes a correctional education guidance package, making a quality education for incarcerated youth a major priority is encouraging, with major investments by consortia of private foundations. In fact, I leave here right after this presentation for a meeting in Chicago for one of these related meetings. Another example that caught my attention is the NSF-funded project RAISE at the University of Massachusetts Amherst Amherst that is a project to increase the mastery of science, content, and critical thinking for incarcerated students. Admittedly, we are also unsettled about the future to sustain such initiatives in the current political climate. So as we think a little bit further about this work and where we might be headed, we are operating on a few basic assumptions, but I'll only mention 3 of them. One is that our U.S. correction system effectively continues to manifest a disturbing legacy of institutional racism and classism in the U.S. Second, we reasonably assume that there are currently African American, Latinos, Native American students in our schools with STEM intellectual capacities whose talent is likely to be wasted because we have yet to develop the right tools to accurately identify and use and effectively teaching them. The third, and we reasonably assume, if we are able to recapture even just 1% of our incarcerated 18 to 24-year-old African American, Latinos, and Native Americans as post-secondary STEM degree recipients, it would make a profound impact on our nation's future. So we conclude with what we can see as our right questions thus far. Can culturally responsive and relevant assessment and evaluation approaches potentially, oh, did I make this? Oh, I didn't make that next one. There you go. Sorry about that. Can culturally responsive evaluation and assessment approaches potentially make a significant contribution to the interrupt the school to prison pipeline for young people of color? Can early identification of those with high STEM-related intellectual capacity and high risk of incarceration increase the number of STEM post-secondary degrees received by these groups? What would be the impact if just 1% of African American, Latinos, and Native American 18 to 24-year-olds received STEM post-secondary degrees instead of prison sentences? The struggle continues. Thank you.
Well, thanks to all of our panelists for some very thought-provoking and provocative comments. I want to introduce now our distinguished moderator, Dr. James Anderson, who is the Edward William and James Marr Gutskell Professor of Education, Head of the Department of Educational Policy, Organization, and Leadership, the Executive Associate Dean for the College of Education and Affiliate Professor of History. His scholarship focuses broadly on the history of U.S. education, with specializations in the history of African American education in the South, the history of higher education desegregation, the history of public school desegregation, and the history of African American school achievement in the 20th century. Also, in addition to his prolific scholarship, he's also served as an expert witness in a series of federal desegregation and affirmative action cases. And so I want to thank you, Professor Anderson, for serving as moderator, and I'll now turn it over to you to oversee the open discussion.
I'll stand and remain standing so I can recognize individuals who have questions and direct them to the panel. I want to get very quickly to the questions, and thanks to all of the panelists for staying within their 5 minutes. What I want to do at this point, and when I was thinking about this, I was sort of reflecting on my existential relationship to the college, which has been a long time. And I came here on an NDEA fellowship in secondary education to get a Master's Plus certification to teach social studies and history at the high school level. And the big question in the college and the whole purpose of the fellowship and the cohort program was to train teachers to educate the disadvantaged. And since then, by my estimation, we've produced over 20,000 teachers and hundreds of principals and superintendents. And so my question to the panelists as I turn it back is, I have 2 questions. How well as we of a college, how well have we done to graduate teachers, principals, and superintendents to address the concerns in your area? And the second question to each one of you is, what is the one thing that you would change in the college to produce more effective leaders and practitioners to deal with these problems? So we'll start with in the same order.
First question related to whether or not how it is that we're preparing the next generation. Certainly, I think we've worked diligently to create a bigger workforce to meet the needs and so on. In regard to how well we're meeting the needs of our students in the state of Illinois, if I limit it to that, and how well our students are performing in terms of that, I would have to say that I do not know if we have data to support any remark that I would make. So in other words, I think we do prepare a number of students, but I don't believe as a college, we do survey them, but I don't know if we have research right now that would actually talk about how well we've done this, especially looking at it longitudinally. So you've just given us a very large number. I'm not sure we've been situated to address that. My own take on it, working in the schools and working in the state, I don't think Illinois is any different than many other states. And by that I mean we struggle with meeting the needs of the kids that we're talking about, Latinos, African Americans. We're still doing that. And I think we're still working on what it is that we need to do. Second part of your question was, remind me again. What would I change? Part of the change, I think, I hear a great deal about language and the fact that this country is changing, has changed, and yet we haven't responded to that. I look at the number of students we produce who speak another language, the number of students we produce who are, even if they didn't start out speaking another language, but who are open to learning another, and going forward and trying to answer and address some of our issues, I would say those numbers are very low. So I think part of what I would change is to really sit down and really start thinking about how is it that we go about doing this. The idea in Illinois, in certain states we can do certain things that we cannot do in Illinois. Just our population, who we have to draw from, et cetera, who comes to our program. So we cannot just simply come up with an easy answer such as we will only take in all students who speak Spanish, let's say, or all students who speak French, let's say. We just simply don't have all those numbers right off the bat to do that. But given our numbers, can we, for example, certain programs on campus require students to they have to take 4 years of a language. That's something simple that we could do. It doesn't mean the person will be proficient, but they would at least have an inclination, a propensity, a disposition to say, this might be what my students will go through. You couple that, I think, with programs such as the bilingual or ESL endorsement, I think you get a little closer in terms of preparing students in terms of that. I think you add to that discussion issues about dialects and what that means. We troubled the notion of who is bilingual in this country, that there's an array of individuals who are bilingual and what that means. I think that's the dialogue we need to really be engaged in. And it's a difficult one. It's one the whole country is dealing with, but we have to take it right at the center of the epicenter.
I would say I don't have a long-range perspective. I don't have the data either to say whether we're doing a good job. I do think that we are encouraging teacher candidates to question and to be critical of what's in front of them, to engage with others outside of their own classrooms, and so on. And in terms of what I might change, I have to say that I think there's a tremendous amount of work being done in CNI, especially with the teacher education redesign. And even prior to that, classes that all students are required to take, which require them to go out into the community, going back to my particular theme, and that require them to interview or work closely in some capacity with their students or community members. And with the Global Perspectives cohort and the new elementary ed redesign, we're asking our students more and more to look outside of the packaged curriculum, right, or the very things that we criticize our schools for doing. That being said, I think it's very easy for us as scholars within this field to mimic what's going on in the schools. It's hard, right? I mean, I think all the things we've been talking about, they're very hard things to overcome. As much as we want to step outside of what we're told to do by policy, by et cetera, it's a challenge. And so I guess what I would say is just to continue to sort of push the dialogues and continue to question and continue to encourage more fluidity or more recognition of the knowledge students come to school already with, et cetera, et cetera. So, easy, right?
Well, I also don't have a long-range perspective in the 18 months that I've been here. I can tell you about last year's teachers, but what I do and what I see my colleagues doing is that what we do learn is that as we're learning new things and as we're becoming more adept and facing these issues and finding ways to challenge these, that goes into the teacher ed program. So in my case, the work that I'm doing in family engagement is in our family engagement course. The work that I do on social context and pedagogy is in my pedagogy courses. And I think that a lot of my colleagues could say the same, that's the advantage of being at a research university, is that that as we learn, we can pass that on. Now what I would change is I would like to have a more diverse group of undergrads. I think that it's not as much the case with the graduate students, but my undergraduate students in early childhood, they are lovely people. They're a very homogenous group, and it makes it very difficult to talk about differing perspectives when the primary perspective in the classroom is, I grew up in a white suburban town.
I'm going to go back there to teach.
Exactly. Yes.
I think that I am new also, 18 months in the College of Education, so I wouldn't really say very much about that. But in the second one, going with Stephanie's, this is something that is very challenging for us as professors, that we step into the classroom to teach white kids, middle class, who want to go back to their hometowns to teach about these issues. It's very challenging. So this is a conversation that we need to start, and all of us together, how we are going to help these students to understand that the classroom in the United States is far by white anymore. It's very diverse, it's very mixed, so we have to address those issues.
You have to realize I'm bringing a little bit different perspective here as being an alum from the 80s here, and then coming back after like after a number of years and coming back and seeing the college now. I guess, and I have to echo the same things that everyone is basically saying regarding, from the first thing is regarding diversifying more that undergraduate teacher preparation population of folks that we're sending out there in the schools. The second, and so along the same lines, I guess, is that at the same time, I'm wondering the extent that we are actually following up with our new folks, who are actually going out and teaching in high needs areas, and then the extent that we're using them not only to support them in their initial work, but also as a way to bridge that and liaise for them at the same time back with the ones who we are also training. And so that's one that I miss. And I think that just from the data standpoint, I don't think we know enough. I don't think we've done a very good job of collecting the kind of information to inform us in terms of how we might better adapt what we're doing, how we might better go about supporting who's out there, and then how we extend that. So I'm a bit biased. I'm an alum, and I feel very good about what we do, but the extent of how long we try to sustain that and make sure that that contributes to what we do in the future and for those that we're preparing now.
Well, thank you very much. We will now appreciate your question, comment, suggestion. Not all at once.
I'm Alex Evans, second year doc student here. When we talk about teaching in classes, especially in classes that are largely homogeneous, as you said, and even in some of the grad level classes that are more diverse, how can we go about really addressing some of these issues when we're really talking about white supremacy and institutionalized racism, but when you actually have those conversations, you have the guilt and the kind of blocking those types of conversations, along with just the overall ignorance that we have of how pervasive it is in different systems. So how can we get around all of that?
Yeah, and I think
Go for it.
we probably all have very different takes on this because we all have very different takes on this because we all do very different things. In my own case, I'm preparing teachers for birth to second grade. And a lot of the work that we do, and this is a lot of the way that we teach children in this program, is really understanding the child and understanding the family and valuing that, whatever that is. And part of the work that we do with our undergrads is kind of helping them to let go of their own background as a norm. Which, I mean, doesn't get to institutionalized racism, doesn't get into white supremacy, but our goal with that group of students is for them to not prioritize the views of students that are like them, or to not other the views of students that are not like them, for them to really see the value in the life of every child in their room.
And I would add to that I think part of getting at some of that, I think we've mentioned about the kind of research we do and the way it pushes against those lines. I didn't speak a great deal about the work that I do, but David mentioned the fact that I work within dual language context, but I specifically work within a dual language context where African Americans and Latinos are side by side, interacting around learning academically and in other social kinds of ways. And part of my interest in that has something to do with what you're getting at in terms of how do you disrupt certain lines that have been set. So how do you get people who may not always interact, may not always have certain kinds of perspectives to develop those perspectives? So I'm at that development component that part of this is maybe we need to understand how those things develop, how it is that we can push against them, and what happens when we create spaces where dialogues can take place without that guilt feeling that you're talking about. I think the other part of it for me is that I've been doing that for 5 years and enjoying that, but now I have bigger questions in terms of at a university setting. I've been doing this long enough to know that it is incredibly hard. It's not just a matter of 18, because it's 18 months or not. It's always difficult to push against those borders. And what I find that's helping me personally, first and foremost, but also I'm trying to bring into my classroom, are the larger questions, so that if I'm disposed to think that my view is superior, how is it that I can bring data in that disrupts that? So it's not me, the instructor, because I am a Black woman and the instructor. There are certain other things that come with that dialogue. So how do I have that dialogue and push it? So I find when I bring data in that looks at these kids are doing things better than expected, or when you put it against even a middle-class kid who's not in a dual language context, what's happening? All of a sudden, you have people saying things like, wait, that doesn't, wait. And that's what I'm looking for, that wait, that pause. And I think it is in that pause you start to have certain kinds of dialogue. I think we need to be pursuing. We need to be pursuing it outside of our own silos. There are bigger questions you're asking. I'm not sure I can say for myself, I cannot answer it singularly. But as part of a network, which right now I've joined the Pyro Network, and my site that is here in Urbana is actually part of an international site. And the whole goal of this endeavor is that we're trying to figure out what does bilingualism look like across the lifespan, worldwide. That's a bigger dialogue. Those people look different, they sound different, there are different languages and so on, and that starts shifting, I hope, the dialogue in some significant kind of way. So doing things differently. It's not comfortable, by the way, for those of us doing it, but that's in part what we have to do. I don't know if I answer your question.
I have a question related to that, and to connect it, I think one of the problems that I see as a TA, and I'm just a first-year doc student, so I'm totally lofty and new at this, but is like we have this separate, especially I'm coming from secondary education, and there's like this separate, majors, and then there are minor education minors. And so my group, my cohort of history majors are actually here to become teachers. But they're required to be history majors and education minors. And the frustration of that is while all the history that they're learning is amazing, a lot of it isn't necessarily directly applicable to what they're going to be doing in their futures. So I have students saying things to me like, well, I was in my class and I was daydreaming about what I should have been, how I could do this in my class, even though I should have been paying attention to the teacher, and they're feeling torn about where they're at. And so when I look at the projection of their program and the classes that they're taking, there's so little time to have these real opportunities to have real conversations with our students. And so another one of my own privileges of being white is that I am white standing in front of white students. And so just yesterday, bringing up the idea of deficit thinking, and none of them had ever heard that term. So I had a chance to be real in front of them and talk about when I learned that I was racist, inherently racist. Little miss, everybody's equal. I had racist thoughts. And when I started to share that realism with them, they opened up in a different way because it was like judgment is over here, but this is the truth. And they wanted to have these conversations, but how can we I guess my question, my convoluted question, is how can we have these conversations when we're not really afforded the space to have them? Because we have to, like you said, we have to have the space to be real with our kids, but we're allowed very little space to be real with them. Students, and that's what they need, and they want to have these conversations. But how can we fight back? How can we fight back? Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but that's such a very different space for you versus me having that conversation, or Yuri having that conversation, and in terms of how do you even start engage in that conversation, and then to allow them the space to feel whatever you're going to need to feel to do that, because we have feelings on the other side of it too, you see. And so partly for me is how to translate that first into some kind of user-friendly language, for lack of a better term, so that it is not terribly uncomfortable, but it does need to be uncomfortable. And so that's going to be a challenge, and I'm kind of getting back to your question as well, too, because I think what ends up happening after all these years of doing this, is what ends up happening is that you rely on a community of resources of people to tell you how to navigate that space with different examples. We've all had very different experiences in terms of these situations. After doing this for I don't know how many years now, in fact, I'm probably not going to try to calculate it now. The point is that one method does not always work the same way each time. It just, and so it's really dependent on what my students here versus my students at Arizona State versus my students at NIU have been different, okay? And so these conversations have been different. So I think you have to make sure that you make use of the resources, your internal resources, plus the community of resources around you. And there has to be someone that you're going to have to be honest with, that person that you trust that judgment on to call you on those spots when you're really a bit off base. And so that's just after, I think that's something that we all have to make decisions on in terms of how we navigate that. And that is always learning. I'm an aspiring culturally responsive evaluator. I'm an aspiring university teacher. I haven't gotten there yet. Hopefully I'll get there eventually.
I think it was Derek and then Rochelle.
I guess more of a practical question. I was fortunate enough to TA EdPsych 202, which is the Exploring Cultural Diversity course. That is, I think, somewhat required. It's partially required, but not really required for pre-service teachers. And I believe 3 or 4 years ago, there was discussion of making that course required for all pre-service teachers. Has there been additional discussion? Because I think that could get to the question that the young lady had up front about finding a space in which to actually have the conversations around race, racial relations, issues of diversity as well, but actually making it a required course. And
Could I answer that?
Yes,
I'd be happy to answer that. So, as part of all of our revised teacher education programs, students will be taking Education 201 and Education 202. Education 202 is specifically social schools and social justice. Education 201 is looking at individuals and within what identity differences, and they have a community experience as part of that. So there has been certainly the idea that we need to work with our students as freshmen to provide spaces for them to think about issues of diversity, identity, culture, etc. And the idea is that what is brought up in those courses then occurs throughout their program, so that it's not just a kind of one and done.
That was actually where I was going. So I'm currently teaching Education 202, and I was just going to say a little bit more about what we do in that class. It's social justice, schooling, and society. And one of the things I really like about it, there's about 120 students in the class, is that we have students that are education minors or majors who see themselves first and foremost going on to become teachers, but we also have people from architecture, people who are non-declared, we have people who are in sociology and philosophy and whatever, and what makes those conversations interesting is that we are able to broaden it so that when we're talking about ideas, every time we talk about professional vocabulary, we talk about what are the kinds of things that you need as a professional to be able to navigate social justice issues, and we don't talk about it just from a kind of becoming an educator. We talk about the distinction between education and schooling so that everybody can be addressing social justice and education in society, not just people who are becoming teachers. But what that allows us to do is it allows us to get into conversations where people who are becoming teachers don't just think about these ideas as, how's this going to help me develop a lesson plan, or how's this going to help me, but it broadens it to think about what kind of a stance do I need to have as an educator who's going to advocate for students or advocate for particular ideas. And that means in conversations with my parents when I go home, that means in, parties I'm at with friends, that means, but it also means in the classroom and in the hallways with my colleagues. And so I think it's nice that we have both of those courses, the identity and difference and the schooling, social justice and society, to kind of set the stage for this is what we do as professionals, rather than, it's just a kind of how does it help you become a better teacher?
Can I follow up real quick?
Yes.
Just my question for either of those classes: do they help the students challenge their own personal biases that they may have come to this university with? That's my one question. Because then
Yeah, one of the first things we talk a lot about, you can't learn unless you're uncomfortable. So we actually our last session was just even talking about, have we gotten too comfortable? Like people seem now, in the beginning there was a lot of white guilt, there was a lot of people not liking what other people were saying in their Moodle posts and not knowing how to respond. Now we've gotten to a point where people seem to be better at doing that. And then I posed the question this week actually is, are we too comfortable? Because people seem like they're okay with these things, and does that mean that we're all just now saying when somebody says something that we think we disagree with, do we just kind of go, no, but I kind of think they're saying the same thing as me, so I'm not even going to raise an issue? Or are we raising those issues because we realize that it's in being uncomfortable that's actually how we grow? So we try as much as possible to have these conversations. Now myself and the 5 TAs, we're all people of color. So that also has different challenges to how we do this kind of stuff. But I feel like I'm very optimistic about the fact that these courses are the first class they come in as freshmen, potentially, and also that there's 2 of them in a row, and that they can, then that becomes, they've started conversations. Obviously, it's not the end. They've started conversations. Obviously, it's not the end, but they've started conversations.
And those ideas then are picked up in some of the existing coursework too, 415,
422, whenever we try
a lot of the methods courses bring them up as well.
Yeah.
So again, the idea, as was mentioned earlier, it's not a one shot in the arm.
Yeah.
Ideally, but again, it's the ideal picture. It's hard to know what goes on. And also I think it's hard to know what, once students leave your classroom, and I've gotten this on my ISIS scores, the teacher was too biased or whatever. The teacher was awfully biased about race or teacher doesn't like white people. Well, but I don't know, and it's hard to know then how, again, those transformative discussions, are those carrying on outside of my classroom where the student wants to get an A? And that's not to bash the students too much, because I do think they're caring and want to be good at their craft. But I would do wish I knew. Again, a wish would be, are these things carrying on outside of these four walls?
But to your question and the points that Dr. Gutierrez and your panel have made about it. So one, I think now that we've redesigned and we're admitting as freshmen, I think that's a really great place because we're starting that dialogue in the classes that like Dr. Gutierrez is leading with the students. So they're starting as freshmen having these conversations instead of as juniors. So it's like 2 extra years that we have them. And I just want to put in a plug for a dissertation. One of our new graduates, Natasha Murray, just defended, and she's a new PhD last week, and her whole dissertation was with one of our cohorts talking explicitly about race and racism and their whiteness and the racism that was going on and everything. And it was a very focused, it's a great dissertation to look at, think about that, and think about whether as she graduates, if there are faculty, and I know we have faculty in our department and other departments, could carry that course on. I mean, it was an amazing course that she co-facilitated with another scholar on camp here, who's another person who's here, a staff member actually. And I just feel like they were having exactly those conversations, very focused on the racism that the students, personal white racism, and how to deal with that, how to work with that and acknowledge it and move beyond it to be a better teacher. And so Natasha Murray's dissertation is, I think, a good place to look at that kind of work. I want to plug for her, look at that kind of work.
When I plug on the nose, I wanted to say, personally, thanks to the C&I department for doing this. It's a lot better than having to think about the budget in class.